it takes time at night, during the weekends. But I think before you do all that, you really have to be passionate about it. You have to be really interested in it. And if you're not, I don't think that you'd put that work in.
Hello and welcome to the Being an Engineer podcast. Today our guest is Steve Maxson, a distinguished figure in the medical device industry with over 2 decades of experience in extrusion technology and medical device manufacturing. As the owner of Maxson InSight Services, Steve offers technical solutions and consulting services, specializing in medical extruders and turnkey systems. In his role at US Extruders, he leads innovation and business development, focusing on crafting robust, customized extruders for diverse applications. Additionally, Steve is the host of the MedTech podcast, where he interviews global experts in medical device contract manufacturing, sharing valuable insights into extrusion technologies, materials, processes, and broader industry trends. He also plays a pivotal role in organizing the medical processing panel events, bringing together thought leaders in MedTech to discuss advancements in catheter manufacturing, silicone processing, thermoplastic processing, and more. I feel like that intro just goes on and on. You're doing and have done so many things already, Steve. Welcome to the show, and thank you for being with us today.
Thanks, Aaron. I'm glad to be on here, and look forward to our conversation.
All right. Well, you're not doing, correct me if I'm wrong, I could be wrong here. I don't think you're doing a lot of day-to-day engineering work right now. You're mostly focused on kind of a business development role. Is that accurate? Yeah,
I am the business development that I'm in is very technical and highly engineered. So I'm involved with engineers and engineering all the time.
So what was it that made you decide to become an engineer?
Well, it kind of runs in the family, Aaron. My grandfather, Donald Maxson, was a very prestigious welding engineer back in the day, welding ship hulls during the World War II. Has a lot of patents on some of those welding processes, now expired, of course. But and my father was an electrical engineer at a company called Davis Standard for many years, 47 years actually.
Wow.
A company that was Davis Standard is a company that's been around since the 1850s, so to speak. So he was an engineer there for 47 years, and I went to school as a mechanical engineer because I knew I was probably going to be an engineer, but I took a drafting course in high school and had a really good drafting teacher. And he said, if you're good at drafting, if you like mechanical things, then maybe mechanical engineering would be a good fit. So that's what I did.
That's funny. I had a similar experience in high school. I took a drafting course, and it was probably one of the most interesting courses I took in high school. That, and there's a physics class that I really liked a lot. But it was so fun just drawing out the different isometric views, and I was hooked.
Yeah, that did it for me.
Well, your career is really focused on extrusion technology, catheters for sure. There are probably other medical device focused extrusion technologies that we'll talk about as well. But how did you get into that area of the industry?
So, as I mentioned, I went to school as a mechanical engineer, and then I followed my father's footsteps and worked at a company called Davis Standard as a mechanical engineer. And I noticed there was a guy there that sold medical extrusion systems. And I said, that's pretty interesting. What is this guy up to? And so I took the initiative to try to understand what he did. And after a while, I was so intrigued by the medical extrusion aspect that I wanted to work for him. So I was able to work for him as a project engineer, managing the large projects and putting together all the layout drawings that showed all the utilities. And every once in a while, he would invite me to a meeting, and I just said, this is what I want to do. I want to be like this guy, Charlie Sparacino at Davis Standard, and sell medical extrusion lines. So that hooked me. And then I was allowed to go to the MD&M East trade show, the first time in New York City. And I've been going to those medical shows ever since. So I've been in that space for a long time now.
How cool that you had such a wonderful mentor at a young age. I love that you used the phrase, I took the initiative, because a lot of people maybe would have heard about this guy or observed this guy, what he was doing, and thought, that's cool, that's interesting, but then not done anything about it. And you grabbed the bull by the horn, so to speak, and made it happen for yourself. Do you remember what were one of the, or two of the things that were particularly interesting for you as you observed this mentor of yours?
Yeah, so that's a good point about the initiative. I remember actually I had to go in and do this type of work with him on my own time, extra time. My full-time job wasn't from the medical, but I came in at nights and just to be part of that group. So there is something to be said for that initiative to that work ethic. If you really want something, you have to go after it. And that's what I did. And I noticed that when we'd walk around the shop, the plant, that was before cell phones, he was always being paged. Charlie Sparacino, dial 010, and he was always picking up the phone because it was always a purchase order that he was getting for a new medical extrusion system. And he'd say the name, and I started to recognize some of the medical device OEMs, and I'd go into the trade show, and it all started to kind of come together. And I left Davis Standard with a couple other people that left to start a company called American Kuna. And I was hired on about a year after they started that organization as an engineer again. And I actually started the medical division within American Kuna. It was kind of a startup extrusion company. And I started the medical extrusion division or business unit, and spent over 20 years visiting all the medical device contract manufacturers, OEMs throughout North America, Europe, and Asia, and really developed a huge network of contacts and a pretty good understanding of all the capabilities of all these different organizations.
There are a few different types of extrusion. Would you spend just a minute talking about the type of extrusion that you're focused on, and just really basic, what is the core technology of extrusion? How does it work? What kind of shapes are you producing? Yeah,
so it's a melt process where you starting with a pellet or a resin feeding into a hopper, and you have a single screw or a twin screw where you're putting shear into the polymer and heat, and you're melting it and pushing it through a die to make, in this case, thin wall medical tubing like this, or tiny medical tubing like this. I know you can't see if you're listening, but I'm showing some pictures of different medical tubing samples. That's the area that I focus in. But extrusion is a very wide range of different applications, from sheet extrusion for like truck bed liners to profile extrusion for all your rigid PVC window frames, corrugated pipe, rigid PVC pipe. All your synthetic fibers for clothing are extruded. The extrusion is ubiquitous.
Yeah, it's all over the place. We use T-slot extrusion as structural framing for machines that we build. Yeah. So specifically in the medical device area, what are a few common places where extrusion technology is used for manufacturing?
Yeah, one of the more higher volume, although more of a commodity medical extrusion, is tubing that's used outside of the body for fluid management or the delivery of drugs, different reagents, solutions to the body, like IV, and then drainage, taking things away from the body during a procedure. Also respiratory tubing, if somebody is on a CPAP or something like that, or some kind of, gas or reagent or agent during a procedure. So that's kind of the outside of the body medical extrusion. And then inside the body for catheters that are being delivered through the anatomy, those are much smaller, thinner walled tubing made from PBACs, nylon, polyurethanes, and all these biocompatible materials that are used to develop a composite catheter shaft.
Nice. And going back to business development just for a second, I imagine there might be some engineers listening to this thinking, I am an engineer right now. I do the, boots on the ground engineering work, but business development, that sounds kind of interesting. Can you go through just a little bit? What is it like being in business development with an engineering background? You mentioned how a lot of the work that you do is pretty technical in nature. And so having that engineering background, I imagine, is a huge boon to you and your company.
Yeah, it's helped me a lot through my career being an engineer and technical in a commercial or business development role. You have a good understanding of, the technical challenges, and you can come up with solutions and then get engineers involved, higher level engineers than I am that can, get into more detail. There is a downside to that. There's a saying that if you're ready to close a deal, if you're a salesperson, you have a final meeting with your customer, the last thing you want to do is bring an engineering to that meeting, right? Because they're going to come up with ways to change it. And we've developed the spec. We're ready to close the deal. We don't need you coming in. Hey, have you considered this or that? So there is a time and place for it.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
Really good point. You also have your own podcast, the MedX podcast. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. A couple of years ago at the large medical device trade show out in Anaheim, California, I was having breakfast with a marketing person that works for me. And I said, we should create a podcast where we talk about all the opportunities, challenges in medical extrusion and catheter development. And he said, yeah, let's think about that. And I just kind of let it go. And then 3 months later, he's like, okay, I figured out how we can do this. I got the software that we need. I'm going to send you a mic and headphones. And we just, okay, I got to get a guest. I got a couple guests, and we just dove right into it and learned along the way. And
how was that for you? Was it pretty comfortable for you getting started? Was there much of a learning curve?
Definitely, it wasn't comfortable for me. It was the first time. It's still, there's always learning to it, right? We're always learning and figuring out ways to enhance things. But at the end of the day, content is king, right? So you might have some, might have the best visuals or things like that, or editing. But at the end of the day, content really drives how interesting the conversation is and how many people might be interested in listening to it.
Absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree. I think it's wonderful these days that there's not a huge barrier to entry. I mean, you have a microphone and you have an internet connection and you can kind of get started, right?
Yeah.
And if you have great content, people are going to listen to it. A lot of the people listening to this podcast are in the medical device industry. Not all of them, but a good portion of them are. What are some of the most significant trends that you see in specifically the medical extrusion technology?
Yeah, I talked about the different types of medical tubing used outside the body, inside the body. So if you're delivering a catheter through a vessel, you're limited on the OD of the tubing that's used or the catheter that's used through the vessel. So if you want to put more things into the inner lumen, inner diameter, drugs, devices, other catheters, you need more space. You want to always maximize the ID. And so you can't change the OD. So that puts pressure on the wall thickness, and we call that profile. And so for catheter development, extrusion, medical extrusion, profile is king. We want the thinnest wall thickness we can get while maintaining functionality so we can put more and more into the lumen or within the catheter. So examples like I showed you or talked about before, a real thin wall, higher diameter tube, like a 1/2-inch OD tube with like a 6 thou wall. They're really an advancement in medical extrusion. Here's a real tiny 40 thou ID tube with a 2 thou wall. So thinner and thinner wall thickness is made from super soft, compliant materials is really where things are headed.
Wow. So there's really kind of a combination there between like a material scientist that's developing the material and then the manufacturing engineers that are working on the equipment that's going to extrude that material. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. And I'm glad you brought that up, Aaron, because the leaders in this space, the companies that really drive innovation, know how to convert material or polymer science to medical extrusion. A company like Zeus, for instance, you look at their web page and all the variety of polymer science and extrusion technologies they have, from fluoropolymers to bioreabsorbables to super thin wall tubing. Companies like that convert a polymer science into extrusion technology. Putnam Plastics is another one. Renegade Medical Extrusion, Spectrum Plastics. These folks are the leaders.
Yeah. Amazing. Back in the day, before I started Pipeline, I worked at a company doing medical device development, and I remember we used heat shrink tubing a lot. And I thought it was one of the coolest materials or components, whatever you want to call it, that I had ever worked with.
Yeah.
Because for those of you listening who aren't familiar with heat shrink tubing, it's exactly what the description, the name sounds like. You apply heat and it shrinks. It starts at a larger diameter. You apply heat, it shrinks to a smaller diameter. And can you tell us a little bit about where is heat shrink tubing used in the medical industry? I'm guessing that you have quite a bit of experience with that.
Yeah, good question, and an interesting topic, because heat shrink tubing is pervasive within medical device manufacturing and medical devices. And it's kind of split up between being a process aid to help you make or fabricate a catheter and heat shrink tubing that actually stays on the product. So for the first set of tubing that would be used as a manufacturing aid only, it's not part of the product, is FEP heat shrink tubing. That's probably the most popular heat shrink tubing in MedTech volume-wise. And it's from fluoropolymer or FEP, typically like a 10 thou wall. And it's placed over a composite catheter shaft that has a composite different a liner, a braid material, different outer jackets, and the FEP heat shrink tubing is placed over that, and it's put through an oven, time and temperature, and it heats and compresses all those materials together to fabricate a composite catheter shaft, and then it's peeled away and discarded. So that's the biggest heat shrink tubing used in MedTech. There are other types of heat shrink, like I said, that stay on the product, like a PET heat shrink, which is super thin wall, maybe 1.5 tenths down to 1.5 tenths, super thin wall that would be used has really good insulation properties. It might be used to protect the braid wire at the end of a shaft to encapsulate it. And again, that would stay on the part. A PBAX heat shrink is another one that's interesting, kind of a newer heat shrink tubing that when it's heated, it'll compress to its substrate and stay on the catheter. It's often used to cover a laser cut hypotube, for instance. And then there's polyolefin heat shrink. That's a polyethylene based heat shrink, also used as an insulation cover. So those are a couple of the examples of different heat shrink tubing used in MedTech.
We worked on a device a little while ago that was a transeptal needle, I think it was, and it's not really a needle. Those of you in medical devices, you're probably very familiar with that. But when I first heard of it, I thought we were going to be getting something sharp. Anyway, that wasn't the case. It's just called a transeptal needle. But at the tip, there's an electrode, and then they used it was about maybe a 3-foot long, very thin metal shaft, and they used heat shrink to cover the entire shaft except for the very distal tip where, 5 millimeters were exposed as an electrode to do its business inside the body. That was a recent area I saw heat shrink tubing used in medical devices.
That's interesting. The transeptal access going to the other side of the heart. Most of these more modern catheters or delivery systems need to have some steerability so that they can do that. And it starts with access. To access the other side of the heart, you have to do the transeptal procedure, like you said. And that used to be more of a mechanical puncture. But with this is now, like you mentioned, it's more of a RF or some kind of energy that's used that's less invasive.
Yeah, and this one was interesting. It did not have any steerability. It was a stainless steel shaft, and I don't really know how they got it in. Maybe I don't think there was even a guide wire axis for it. It was an interesting product. Well, let me take a very short break here and share with the listeners that the Being an Engineer podcast is brought to you by Pipeline Design and Engineering, where we don't design pipelines, but we do help companies develop advanced manufacturing processes, automated machines, and custom fixtures, complemented with product design and R&D services. Learn more at teampipeline.us. The podcast is also sponsored by The Wave, an online platform of free tools, education, and community for engineers. Learn more at thewave.engineer. We're privileged today to be speaking with Steve Maxson. So, Steve, one of the collaborations that you have started is with a company called Chamfer, and we've actually had Julie from Chamfer here as a guest on the show as well. I think what they're doing is very cool. How do these partnerships, in your experience, facilitate innovation and increase efficiency for engineers in this field?
Yeah, Chamfer is a great company, and I told you how I love this space. I put my money where my mouth is too, and invest in some of these businesses.
Oh, interesting.
So there's a couple companies that I've invested in, and I just think they're rock star people. The organizations and the concept is great. Chamfer has really created a paradigm shift in how catheter designers develop in new catheters, where they can get their hands on thousands of different components through the Chamfer store and have it on their desk literally the next day if they need it. And so they can iterate and try different prototypes. And maybe once they do that, they can get to kind of a point where they might be buying a tube or a component off a chamfer. They can reach out to that customer and said, "Hey, I tried some of this tubing or a hypo tube that you had on chamfer. It looks good, but really I need to change the diameter by, and increase the diameter by a couple thou, change a few things, and it creates more of a customized solution for everybody." So it's really a win-win, and it's really had a major impact on the industry to really reduce development times.
Yeah, because before, and I remember going through this 15, 20 years ago when I was working on a catheter product, in order to get samples, maybe you could find something off the shelf. But if you're looking for anything that was even close to custom, you had to order a short run of this, of the tubing, the extrusion. And that was expensive, not just in dollars, but in time. It took a lot of time, right? And so now you can go to Chamfer and order off the shelf samples. They might not quite have exactly what you want, but sometimes they do. And if they don't, they probably have something pretty close, at least for R&D.
Right. Speed is king in R&D.
Speed is king. That's right. Yeah. You have also helped to organize an event called the Medical Processing Panel. I'd love to just understand more what has been your involvement there, and tell us a little bit about the event and how engineers are benefiting from it.
Yeah, thanks. It's kind of a spinoff, Aaron, of the podcast. So let's create content at a nice venue, not a stuffy hotel. We try to do it at a nice golf course or something where there's a lot of good visual displays and nature and things like that, and like I said, in a stuffy hotel. And so we don't really have any PowerPoint presentations. There's no death by PowerPoint. There's no sales pitches. There's no salespeople getting up there trying to sell their products. It's just open conversation like we're having now with subject matter experts in different fields of medical extrusion, catheter technologies, molding, and, the miniaturization of medical devices. So there's usually really good moderators that kind of drive everything for each panel session. And we have really great subject matter experts. And we talk about some of the industry challenges and opportunities that we're all facing.
We'll have links in the show notes, but for those who are just listening and maybe forget to look at the show notes, where can people go to find out more about MPP?
Yep, we're going live with the agenda for MPP East next week, probably when this is live. That'll be June 1st at UMass Lowell in the Boston area. And we're going to have 4 different panel sessions: catheter technologies, thermoplastic and thermoset processing. So we're going to combine the thermoplastics with like the silicone and the polyimide with other, melt processes. And we're going to have a panel session on the miniaturization of MedTech. So micro extrusion, micro molding, micro 3D printing. And then we're going to have a new panel session dedicated to nitinol. Nitinol is the most magical material ever, right? And
it is. It's black magic.
It's not just a material. There's all these different processes that go into nitinol. So we're going to have subject matter experts related to melting, gun drilling, tube drawing, laser processing, and chemical processing as well.
Very cool. And there are, I think, 3 different MPP events. Is that right? East, West, and Minnesota,
yes.
Maybe?
West, East, and Minnesota. And then soon we'll be heading out to Ireland.
Fantastic. Yep. So what kinds of engineers would benefit the most? Medical device, especially those working in catheters, any other discipline of engineer that would be particularly well suited to attend?
Yeah. Anybody, leaders, engineers that are involved in MedTech, interventional catheter technologies, would learn a lot. Like I said, there's no sales pitches. There's no death by PowerPoint. It's all content and some pretty good food.
Good food. You had me there. Okay. And I think that you have some information there about like venture capital as well. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. We just started to do that at the last event, MPP West, that was held in the Salt Lake City area. And I was a little reluctant to do it, but the private equity involvement in MedTech and contract manufacturing, it's integral, right? It's a huge part of raising capital, bringing resources in to grow to meet the demand. And we had the first private equity panel, and it was really good, actually. People loved it because these folks, they own companies that are in the space. They see the tailwinds, they see the headwinds, and they were able to share a lot of those, trends. And most all of them are really optimistic, too, about 2025.
So you talk about a variety of things. The panelists speak about a lot of different things at MPP, catheter manufacturing. You mentioned the miniaturization, micro 3D printing. What are some of the technologies or trends that you are most excited about over the next several years in MedTech?
Yeah, there's a lot going on right now. I wouldn't say it's exciting to me, but it's important. The fluoropolymers and the PTFE and the PFAS potential regulations, everybody's kind of waiting to see how that'll turn out. We all believe that, there'll be an exception for medical. When you think about PTFE, it's one of the most amazing polymers ever. And it's used to cover stents, for instance, and all kinds of minimally invasive applications, implantable. And when we implant a PTFE component as part of a catheter, we want it to maintain its integrity throughout its life. So they say it's a forever chemical. That's the point. We want it to stay, use it patent. We want to maintain its integrity for the life while it's in vivo. So we're hoping that that'll be an exception. But in the meantime, a lot of people are looking at alternatives to PTFE for some of those properties. So there's a lot of work and development going on to look at these alternative materials.
Yeah. So you do a variety of things, right? You have your own consultancy. You work in business development, a technical aspect of business development at US Extruders. You have the podcast. You have, or I shouldn't say you, I guess, but you're heavily involved in the MPP conference. Mm-hmm. I imagine at US Extruders, this next topic is something that you have to deal with. And I'm curious to hear if you and your team have come up with some best practices that you can share. But there's always this kind of pull and tug between innovation on one side and regulatory compliance on the other side. And the two at times can be at odds with one another. Have you found any best practices to kind of accommodate both at the same time?
Yeah, I think, how we had the conversation of being an engineer really helps in business development for technical products. At the same time, you have to be have a pretty good understanding of the regulatory landscape and how devices go through these different phases in order to get approved, 510K1 approval, and OQ, PQ, all these different regulatory aspects of a medical device. You really need to understand that so that you can see the whole picture. Because if you don't, then you're kind of in the dark. So I would highly recommend. I mean, there's a lot of smart regulatory people that I work with. Luckily, I'm not one, but I have really smart people that are in that space. But you have to understand that regulatory process for approval of a device, because it's not like a more industrial application. If you develop something, get it on the market, there's a pathway that has to be followed very strictly in order to get to that next phase to go into production. And that could take 2 to 3 to 5 years. So you need to understand that regulatory path. And more of the medical device OEMs are pushing more activities and services onto the contract manufacturers, including more regulatory.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a good segue into this next question. If I'm a young engineer really interested getting into medical devices, what are some of the skills or traits or industry knowledge that I should start developing to be successful?
That's a good question because, I wanted to learn as much as I could, and I couldn't find a lot out there until I discovered Google Patents. And, you think about reading patents, not the most exciting thing in the world, but there's a lot of good information. If you want to learn about simple procedures like angioplasty to start with, basically all the patents for angioplasty came out of a company called SciMed, which is Boston Sci now in Minneapolis. So you just got to you got to research these things, talk to people as much as you can and learn as much as you can, because it really is an awesome space to be in. I wouldn't want to be in any other space.
What are a couple of your favorite things about being in the medical device industry?
The people. You can't beat the people that we work with, from the engineers, commercial people, the organizations. There's just some beautiful blue chip medical device companies out there: Siemens, Boston Scientific, Medtronic, W.L. Gore, Abbott, Edwards Life Sciences. These are all great companies to do business with. And all these companies treat their customers and their contract manufacturers with a high level of respect.
I can attest to that. Without naming names, we do work for some of these companies, and they really have been wonderful to deal with. One of the questions I like asking all of our guests is, what is one thing that you have done or observed to accelerate the speed of engineering? There's
a couple things now. We talked about chamfer. That's one, right? Have access to components very quickly. For the development or engineering of medical devices, there's a lot of different simulation tools that you can use to simulate how a catheter will function for its given application. There's software tools. You can build a catheter basically on a computer with a program and understand how it'll deflect, understand the torsional aspects, how it, torque and the tensile strength. And then you can actually build a prototype from that and test it out on some pretty good fixtures and things. Companies like Machine Solutions have really good ways to test out catheters where there's load cells in different areas. You can look at the force at different areas within the tortuous anatomy. And what's happening now, contract manufacturers, told you how everything's being pushed down from the OEMs to the contract manufacturers. And one of the major aspects is biosimulation. The companies like Switchback Medical in the Minnesota area, Resolution Medical, they have full suite of the ability to test devices on real cadavers with full visualization, fluoroscopy, MRI, CT, so that you can really take things to the next step, because there's kind of, the animals are kind of falling out of favor. People don't want to use animals for different clinical reasons. So the biosim labs is another area where The contract manufacturers are going beyond extrusion and molding and building catheters to being able to really test these devices on real cadavers under pumping blood and those type of situations.
Yeah. Yeah. So having access to phantom environments in which you can quickly test your product, right?
Right.
Yeah. I want to bring up one other thing that I thought of earlier when you were talking about the early days in your career, and you had this mentor and he kind of took you under his wing and showed you some things, but you were doing a lot of this on your own time. It wasn't paid work, right? And I think I sound old saying this, right? When I was a kid and this generation, this and that.
Yeah.
But young engineers approach me a lot, and they ask me, how can I get better really fast? And a lot of them, the answer they don't want to hear is spend more time. But that's, I think, a huge part of it. Is one way to accelerate the speed of engineering is to spend more time. I'm not suggesting that everyone should go out and work 60, 70, 80 hour week. That obviously that's not sustainable or healthy. But if you put in an extra 5 hours over time, that really adds up to a lot, just like you did.
Yeah.
And I'm sure the time that you spent putting in the work at no charge, you weren't being compensated for it. That probably opened up a lot of doors and opportunities that otherwise may not have been available to you.
That's a good point. And that work ethic that I had back then, I still have now, right? Doing things instead of I have the side business you mentioned, and it takes time late at night during the weekends. But I think before you do all that, you really have to be passionate about it. You have to be really interested in it. And if you're not, I don't think that you'd put that work in if you didn't.
Yeah. Yeah. You need to have some kind of purpose that's driving those activities.
Yep. Absolutely.
One more point on that. I also thought about this author, Earl Nightingale, who I think he's passed away for he's been passed away for some time now, but he has this wonderful book or audio program called Lead the Field. And one of the things he talks about, I think he makes this really beautiful analogy about putting the work in before you get the result. He uses the analogy of a fire, and the heat from the fire would be the result that you're looking for, but you don't get that heat until you put the fuel in, right? Yeah. Put the logs into the fire. You're never just going to have the heat without putting the logs in. And I always thought that was such a nice analogy for life, right? You're never going to get the success that you're looking for until you put those logs in, the work, the time, the effort.
Yeah. And sometimes, a lot of times you don't get paid for that.
Right? 100%. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All right, Steve. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. What a delight it's been getting to know you and hearing some of your industry insights and wisdoms. How can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, they can check me out on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active there, posting at least once a week. You can look at my website, MaxsonInsightServices.com. And you could also email me at smaxson909@gmail.com.
Wonderful. Again, thank you so much, Steve.
This has been fun, Aaron. Thank you for having me.
I'm Aaron Moncur, founder of Pipeline Design and Engineering. If you liked what you heard today, please share the episode. To learn how your team can leverage our team's expertise developing advanced manufacturing processes, automated machines, and custom fixtures, complemented with product design and R&D services, visit us at teampipeline.us. To join a vibrant community of engineers online, visit thewave.engineer. Thank you for listening.